Welcome to May McKinney Podcast.
Welcome to the May McKinney Podcast with Shyanne Riddle. Shyanne is a Nashville criminal defense attorney and managing partner at May McKinney PLLC, where work focuses on trial advocacy, trauma-responsive representation, and the overlap between victimization and the criminal justice system. I'm LeAnn Lyon, and today we are talking about how trauma, abuse, and victimization can intersect with criminal charges and why understanding that context can completely change the way a case is approached. Hello, Shyanne.
Hi, LeAnn.
Shyanne, a major part of your background involves the overlap between victimization and a criminal justice system. What first drew you towards that type of work?
It's interesting. It's hard for me to talk about that without talking about how I landed in law school in the first place. So I was a young single mom finishing my undergraduate degree, navigating the criminal justice system as a victim of domestic violence and a petitioner for an order of protection. I was in a really fortunate position that we had a family friend willing to walk me through the order of protection piece of my case, but I didn't have anyone walking me through the criminal portion and navigating that as a victim. For me personally, was honestly just, it wasn't harmful. It was more like, this can't be what it actually is like. There was so little communication and so little information given to me that there was no way for me to meaningfully engage with the system. It was almost like they didn't need me.
Mm.
And that felt almost just as hurtful in a way. So I was in law school and realized that the work that I wanted to do was with people who had experienced things like me. And I knew that it could have so easily been the other way around. Had a single fact changed, or maybe the cops came on a different day, or some little piece of my story changed, I could have easily been the person arrested. I could have easily been the person navigating the criminal justice system and being defined by this one moment without the context of what got me there. And I have pretty much taken that through my entire practice as a therefore by the grace of God go I mantra. I'm not here doing this work from a place of a savior complex. It's because I could easily be in my client's seat.
Wow. What I hear is almost like you recognize that there is almost a double victimization is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
Okay. I know that in law school, you worked with survivors of trafficking through a nonprofit legal program, and you realized later that many of those same individuals were also facing criminal charges, like you said, they're on both sides of the fence, essentially. What stayed with you from that experience?
The way that the nonprofit was funded was through grant funding. They received money through state and federal grants. And these grants limit the nonprofit in the sense that they weren't allowed to provide any criminal defense. I was in this position where I wasn't paid by the nonprofit, and so I was not limited by those restrictions. And I ended up doing a lot of volunteer work using the training and the expertise from the nonprofit, and then going and doing criminal defense for these people that absolutely qualified as people who had experienced human trafficking, either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, but they were also charged with crimes. And I recognized really quickly that there was this gap in services for anyone charged with a crime. Sure, we could work on expungements if this was an old case and maybe we were working on cleaning up your record. But if you were actively being charged and experiencing the criminal justice system, not as a victim, there were no services for you. You were at the mercy of a public defender or at the mercy of a court-appointed lawyer. And those, unless it's a very specific office, most public defenders' offices and court-appointed lawyers don't have specific trauma training and background to be able to connect and then tell a complex story of abuse and victimization. And that's something that stuck with me, which is why May McKinney still does pro bono work for people who have experienced trafficking. We take certain serious cases and we use that training, and my team continues to do trauma trainings so that we can help fill that service gap.
It seems like a lot of criminal cases get reduced down to police reports and charges that are just on paper. What part of a person's story or background do you think the system sometimes misses?
All of it. I mean, that piece of paper is often incomplete, sometimes just wrong, and you can never assume a person's story by reading that report. It was one of the main things I learned as a young attorney. No one really teaches you in law school that you're going to have to eventually meet with people and really find out, are we a good fit to work together? And early on, what I would do as part of my process is I would get a copy of the police report and I would read it before the meeting. I cannot tell you how many times I would get a copy of that police report and I would think to myself, I don't want to do this meeting. This is going to be a terrible case. This is an open and shut case. And I'm finding I'm making these really quick snap second judgments of someone based on this piece of paper. And then they come in and I meet them. And by the end of the meeting, I'm ready to burn it all down for them. I am ready to go into battle. They have their warrior. And I quickly learned that I can read those, but now I just start a meeting by saying, okay, can you tell me what happened? Because I know it's not what's on this piece of paper.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. In the cases that you've handled, what are some of the ways that abuse, trafficking, coercion, or even long-term trauma can shape the circumstances that eventually lead someone into, unfortunately, the criminal justice system?
I could talk about this for an hour, so I'm going to rein it in and give you a few examples. The first one is one of my very first cases I had as a baby lawyer. I worked with a client who had complex trauma, had definitely experienced a trafficking situation, and had had a pretty traumatic childhood in addition to her trafficking situation. What we ended up working on for her is she was in this little simple assault kind of spat with another woman. They were in a social setting, and what ended up happening is my client had kind of gotten backed into an actual literal corner, and this other woman was speaking loudly using big hand gestures. And because of PTSD and the way that it impacts our brain and the way trauma processes, my client did lash out and did strike this person. And we ended up discussing with the DA, like, yes, and she was responding to an old situation. She wasn't responding to this situation. So sitting here and saying she intended to do this can never be true. If you put me in front of a jury, we are going to hire someone to come in here and explain that she did not intend to do anything in this moment because she wasn't even in that room in that moment. She was somewhere else completely, reacting to a completely different scenario. She never intended to strike this particular person in this particular moment.
Hmm.
And, sometimes the prosecutor cares about these kinds of details and sometimes they don't. And you have to meet that prosecutor where they are. There's no point in me coming in and talking about the science of trauma and what it does to our brain and how it impacts our decision making if I'm talking to someone that truly doesn't care to understand. And so then my job is to then pivot the conversation and talk to them in a way that they do care about and figure out a way to relate it to something in their life that they will understand.
Excellent. Well, the idea of parentification, say that 5 times fast, show up in criminal cases involving victims and survivors. What does that look like in real life, and why can it create additional pressure on people who are already dealing with trauma?
It is wild to me how quickly we can come in to someone else's story and think we know what's best for them.
Mhm.
Think that for whatever reason, we can say, well, this is what you need to do, or this is going to be really hard for you. And I don't want you to have to do something that's really hard for you. Instead, why not say, okay, if you want to pursue this process, here's what it's going to look like. This is the way the courtroom's laid out. This is the seat that you would sit in. They would ask you to raise your right hand, swear to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. They're going to ask you parts of your story, and you get to tell your story. You get to look at the judge, you get to look at the jury, and then a defense attorney is going to stand up and they're going to ask you questions. And that's going to be really hard, but we can talk about some tools to get through it. Essentially, what we're doing is empowering our client by saying, this is a choice you get to make, not me, not anyone else. This is a choice you get to make. And if you want to do it, I'm just going to help you do it. I'm going to help you sit there and not dissociate if we can help it, right? Um, it's very different than a prosecutor and a defense attorney in a back room, and they're having a whole conversation about, well, I don't want this person to have to do this. This is going to be really hard. Yeah, let's just make this choice for them. And then I'm going to go out and I'm going to pitch it to them as that's the best decision. That's an example of parentification of anyone through this process, is thinking that you know what's best for them and then taking the decision away.
Wow. So, what are some situations where having an independent attorney for a victim can become important?
Yeah. You know, when you are a victim in a criminal case, typically the state of Tennessee has a victim witness coordinator, and that is the primary point of contact for you. It is really important for victims to understand that they don't have attorney-client privilege with the state of Tennessee. They don't have attorney-client privilege with that victim witness coordinator. That DA represents the state of Tennessee. Their job is to seek justice, is to actually prosecute this case, not represent the victim in the case. There are victims who don't want to prosecute, and the DA's office doesn't care and won't listen. There are victims that want to prosecute, and maybe the DA tried to call them and their voicemail box was full. And so they missed an important update for their case, and the case got dismissed, all because their voicemail was full. If you hire a lawyer to help you navigate the system, we get to say, hi, we represent this person who has an interest in this case. Please notify us, call us, and we will make sure that they get this important information. We will attend hearings that they don't necessarily have to attend, but then we can come back and say, okay, here's what happened in court. We can be involved more in the plea negotiations or the discussions about, can this person testify or not, behind the scenes, than a DA's office is necessarily willing to involve a private person navigating the system alone.
So, as we wrap up today's episode, after working on these kinds of cases now for years, How has your understanding of accountability, victimization, and human behavior changed from when you first started practicing law?
Mm. A DA teased me the other day. I was walking into court and he said, "Tell me why your client's innocent today, Cheyenne." And, it's not that I always think my client didn't do something wrong. It's that I always think there's a story as to how they landed in the position they landed in, and that story has value and they have value. It's about talking to clients in a way that they've never been spoken to before. It's about taking the time to say, "Oh, I see that you're here for your fourth DUI. And I'm looking at these arrest dates for these prior DUIs, and they all happen around the same time. Can you tell me what happened that's significant in your life during this time period?" That is something that happened in this office. And the client looked at me and he said, "That's the month my dad died 10 years ago. And I have a really hard time with his death. And I go out and I drink." And I said, "Thank you for telling me." And then we started to have a conversation about grief therapy and would he ever be interested in working with a therapist? And then by the time we were able to go talk to the DA, it was, "Hey, here's what's going on." And instead of him being here again next year, we're getting him resources so that this doesn't keep happening and he can cope with this a different way.
Hmm.
Uh, we're all humans experiencing this world together. And it's really easy to dehumanize people in the criminal justice system. And I just have very little tolerance for it.
Cheyenne, your heart truly shines through. Thank you so much for taking this time to work with us today. And for our audience, that is it for today's episode of the May McKinney Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Shyanne Riddle and the team at May McKinney PLLC, visit maymckinneylaw.com. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this show with someone who may need it. Thank you, Shyanne.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.